Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going right to the heart of how life works, really. We're looking at how a cell manages its own internal traffic flow. We are deep diving into the just astonishing mechanisms that regulate enzyme activity.
It's all about keeping things in balance.
Exactly. It's about homeostasis. That's the word for it, right? The ability to maintain a constant internal environment, a concept that goes way back to Claude Bernard, and the term itself from Walter Pannon.
Right. And our mission today is to unpack that, to really get into the sensor response machinery inside the cell.
How enzymes get sped up, slowed down, and why, critically, when this system fails. Well, that failure is often the very definition of disease.
Oh, absolutely. The stakes could not be higher. When this regulatory machinery breaks down, the results are catastrophic. And this isn't some rare theoretical failure.
No, it's central.
It's a hallmark of so many major diseases.
So let's jump right in there. The clinical importance.
Yeah.
What are some of the most, let's say, dramatic failures that our sources point to?
Okay, look at cancer. It's a perfect example. Oncogenic viruses, they often work by introducing these enzymes called protein tyrosine kinases.
And what do they do?
They modify the proteins that control gene expression. They essentially find the cell's growth signals and slap a permanent go sticker on them. Uncontrolled growth. That's cancer.
A permanent on switch.
Exactly. Or, for sheer scale of failure from a single tweak, think about the cholera toxin. The toxin from Vibrio cholerae. It permanently jams that cellular on switch, but this time in your intestinal lining.
How does it jam it? What's the biochemistry there?
It's a process called ADP ribosylation. The toxin uses it to chemically modify G proteins.
G proteins are the little regulators, the messenger.
They're the regulators, yes. And this modification locks the enzyme they control, adenyl cyclase, into an unrestricted on position. It just churns out messengers nonstop.
And the result is?
Massive fluid loss, diarrhea, severe dehydration.
Yeah.
It's a tiny, tiny molecular change causing a complete system-wide collapse.
That's terrifying. And it's not just external toxins. Even our own defense systems can be, regulated against us.
They can. A grim example is the plague, Yersinia pestis. This bacterium has a weapon. It deploys a protein pyrethine phosphatase.
So the opposite of the cancer virus, this one removes tags.
Precisely. It removes the phosphate tags from proteins in our protective macrophages. By doing that, it basically cripples the macrophage. It strips it of its ability to move, to engulf the invader.
So all of these modifications, phosphorylation, acetylation, this ubiquitination we'll get to, they're more than just on-off switches.
So much more. What's fascinating is that they create a kind of protein-based code. It's a way of storing and transmitting information. We actually call this epigenetic information.
A layer of instructions on top of the DNA.
Exactly. It can be inherited, it can be maintained, but it doesn't depend on the DNA sequence itself. The physical shape of a protein, tweaked by a simple chemical tag, becomes its own instruction set.
That sets the stage perfectly. So if that's the code, let's start breaking it down. Part 1. Controlling the flow. And we can start with something that sounds a bit counterintuitive. Passive control. How can control be passive?
It sounds like an oxymoron, right? But it relies on a really precise natural state. For most enzymes in a pathway, the cell works hard to keep the substrate concentrations, well, pretty close to their nanomolar values.
And the millimolars is the substrate concentration where the reaction runs at half its max speed. So why is that the sweet spot? Why not have tons of substrate ready to go?
Well, think about it. If the substrate concentration is way, way above the nanomolar level, the enzyme is already running at full speed. It's a V-Michaelis. It's redlined.
So it has no more capacity. If a big surge of material comes in, it can't respond.
It can't process it any faster.
Mm.
But by keeping the concentration right around $molars, the cell maintains its crucial buffer. A little more substrate comes in, the reaction speeds up proportionally. A little less, it slows down.
So the cell passively coordinates the flow just based on supply and demand.
Exactly. It's elegant.
And this leads to what our sources call a dynamic steady state. The levels of the intermediates in the pathway stay pretty constant, and they emphasize the flow is generally unidirectional, one way.
Even if some of the individual reactions are technically reversible, the overall flow is guaranteed. It's thermodynamics. You can think of it using the hydrostatic analogy.
Like water in pipes.
Right. Water flowing from a high point to a low point. The overall drop in height guarantees the direction of flow, even if there are little kinks in the pipe where it briefly goes up a bit.
Glycolysis is the classic textbook example. It has this huge favorable overall energy change, a GG of about nanox of 96 kilojoules per mole. You just can't run that whole pathway backwards.
You can't. To make glucose, in gluconeogenesis, The cell has to use different, distinct enzymes to get around the three most energetically downhill steps. It has to build a separate bypass.
That need for efficiency also explains compartmentation, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's about physical separation. Anabolic pathways, the ones that build things up, are often in a different place than catabolic ones that break things down.
Like fatty acid synthesis happening in the cytosol.
While fatty acid oxidation is happening inside the mitochondria,
Yeah.
separating the machinery prevents them from just running in a futile cycle.
And we even see it with coenzymes. The cell keeps different pools of them.
It does. It discriminates. Text NADP+ is generally for catabolism, for generating electrons. But text HT, that's the primary electron donor for building things, for biosynthesis.
Okay, so with this vast network, where does the cell apply its heavy-handed active control? It can't possibly regulate every single step.
It doesn't need to. It's strategic. It targets only a select few enzymes, the rate-limiting steps,
The bottlenecks.
the bottlenecks. You control the narrowest point on the assembly line, and you control the output of the entire factory.
And that's exactly why statin drugs are so incredibly effective.
It is. They inhibit one enzyme, HMG-CoA reductase. That happens to be the catalyst of the rate-limiting step in making cholesterol. You hit that one choke point, and you effectively shut down cholesterol production.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's move on to the two main strategies for that active control. Let's start with the long game, regulating enzyme quantity.
This is the slow, adaptive response.
Hmm.
You have to remember that proteins are in this constant state of flux. They're always being synthesized and always being degraded.
A dynamic equilibrium.
Right. And changing the total amount of an enzyme takes time, usually hours. So this is for longer-term adaptations, responding to a big change in your diet, for instance.
So on the synthesis side, you have induction and repression. An inducer, like a substrate, can actually stimulate the transcription of its own enzyme's gene.
Right, like beta-galactoside inducing its enzyme in bacteria.
Yeah.
And the opposite is repression. Too much of an end product can shut down the synthesis of the enzyme that makes it. Both involve these DNA sequences called cis elements and the proteins that bind to them, the transacting factors.
And on the other side of the coin, you have quality control. Degradation. How does a cell get rid of old or defective enzymes?
That is the job of a beautiful piece of machinery called the ubiquitin-proteasome pathway. This is the cell's disposal system.
And it uses a tag, right? Ubiquitin.
It's a small protein tag, and the system for attaching it is incredibly selective. A set of enzymes called E3 ligases are responsible for attaching chains of ubiquitin to the target protein.
So the E3 ligases are the spotters. They decide who gets the tag.
They're the spotters. They recognize signs of damage, a bit of unfolding, oxidation, and once a protein is tagged with that ubiquitin chain, it's basically marked for death. It gets fed into the type 6S proteasome.
And that's the wood chipper.
It is. It's a hollow cylinder, which is important. It protects the rest of the cell from, random destruction. Only ubiquitin-tagged proteins can get in to be degraded. And when this system fails, we see it contributing to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
Okay, so that's the long game quantity control. But what about right now? A hormone just hit the cell membrane, or you just got startled. The cell needs to react in fractions of a second.
Right now, you need to regulate the catalytic activity of the enzymes that are already there.
And this is where allosteric regulation shines.
It really does. A small molecule, an effector, binds to a site on the enzyme that is not the active site. But that binding causes a shape change, a conformational change, that instantly alters the enzyme's speed.
The most elegant version of this has to be feedback inhibition.
Oh, it's beautiful. The final product of a long pathway, product D, comes all the way back to the beginning and inhibits the first enzyme, ENZ1.
And the really clever part is that D usually looks nothing like the substrate for ENZ1. It's a handshake designed purely for regulation.
Exactly. And it gets even more sophisticated in branched pathways. Let's say you have 4 end products. If you have too much of just one of them, you don't want to shut the whole system down.
You'd starve the cell of the other 3.
Right. So the cell uses tricks, like having multiple versions of that first enzyme, each one sensitive to a different end product. It's incredibly fine-tuned.
The model enzyme here is ATCase, aspartate transcarbomoylase. It's part of the pathway for making pyrimidines, the C's and T's in DNA.
And it's inhibited by the end product, CTP. Classic feedback.
But, and this is the cool part, it's activated by ATP, which is a purine. Wait, why would a purine, the A's and G's, activate the synthesis of the other type of building block?
It's brilliant feed-forward logic. It's the cell ensuring balance. If purine levels ATP are high, the cell basically assumes, okay, we're getting ready to build DNA or RNA. We need to make pyrimidines to match.
It's like a contractor saying, I've got all the blocks, now start pouring the concrete.
That's a perfect analogy. And high ATP can actually override the inhibition from CTP. It shows metabolic priority.
So this allosteric control can change the enzyme's kinetics, but there's another rapid method, one that is physiologically irreversible, zymogens.
Zymogens, or proenzymes, these are inactive precursors. Think of things like pepsinogen or trypsinogen in your digestive system.
And they're activated by being cut.
By selective proteolysis, a specific peptide bond is snipped. And once that piece is gone, you can't really put it back. So it's a one-way switch.
But why use a permanent switch when so much of regulation is reversible?
Two big reasons: protection and speed. It protects the tissue where the enzyme is made. You do not want digestive enzymes activating inside the pancreas. That's pancreatitis.
Right, autodigestion.
And it also allows for a massive rapid mobilization of activity when you need it. Think blood clotting. You need that cascade to happen now.
Okay, so before we get to how all this integrates, we need to touch on second messengers. This is how the outside world talks to the inside of the cell.
The hormone, or the nerve impulse, that's the first messenger. It hits the cell surface, and that triggers the synthesis or release of these specialized allosteric effectors inside the cell. Those are the second messengers.
The classic example is CAMP, right?
Cyclic AMP, yes. Synthesized in response to epinephrine, or calcium ions,
Yeah.
released by nerve impulses to trigger muscle contraction.
And this is where it all comes together. The really complex, sophisticated world of reversible covalent modification and these integrated networks. Let's start with the king of modifications, phosphorylation.
It's the most common one in mammals, by far. You have protein kinases that transfer that high-energy gamma-phosphoryl group from an ATP molecule onto an enzyme.
Specifically onto the hydroxyl groups of serine, threonine, or tyrosine residues.
Right. But here's a key point. You can't just run that reaction backwards to remove the phosphate.
Why not?
It's too thermodynamically favorable. It's like water flowing over a huge waterfall. To get the water back up, you need a different system. You need a pump.
And in the cell, that pump is a separate set of enzymes.
The protein phosphatases. They remove the phosphate group by hydrolysis. It's a completely separate reaction.
And the impact of adding that phosphate group is huge.
It's massive. That group has a -2 charge. It's bulky. It can form new salt bridges. It forces a conformational change that can dramatically alter the enzyme's activity or even tell it where to go in the cell.
And it can go either way. Phosphorylation can turn an enzyme on or it can turn it off.
Exactly. For glycogen phosphorylase, phosphorylation means go. For glycogen synthase, phosphorylation means stop. It's a context-dependent switch.
And while phosphorylation gets all the attention, we're now realizing that acetylation is just as important.
It's everywhere. We used to think it was just for histones, for DNA packaging. But now we know it modifies thousands of core metabolic enzymes. Glycolysis, the TCA cycle, you name it.
So here, an acetyl group from acetyl-CoA gets attached to a lysine residue. What's the chemical consequence there?
It neutralizes a positive charge. You're converting a potentially charged basic amine into a neutral amide. That changes the local electrostatic environment completely.
And deacetylation is done by a special class of enzymes.
The sirtuins. And what's so cool about them is that they use textan-AD plus dollars as a substrate to do their job.
Which links this modification directly to the cell's energy status.
It's a direct link. If the cell is well-fed, acetyl-CoA is high, which promotes acetylation. But if nutrients are scarce, the textan-AD-ADH ratio goes up. The sirtuins see that high textan-AD plus dollar and start deacetylating things, which often coordinates the shutdown of energy-hungry biosynthetic pathways.
So this is how it all integrates. You have allosteric effectors, phosphorylation, acetylation, all creating these incredibly complex networks. The phosphorylation state of a single protein can act as a kind of decision node.
It is a decision node. It's reflecting the sum of all the different signals the cell is receiving. Great example is AMP-activated protein kinase, or AMPK.
That's the low energy sensor.
It is. When AMP levels are high, that's a signal the cell is low on energy. AMPK turns on, and what does it do? It phosphorylates and inhibits both HMG-CoA reductase for cholesterol synthesis and acetyl-CoA carboxylase for fatty acid synthesis.
So one low energy signal coordinates the shutdown of two major anabolic pathways.
It's metabolic triage.
Let's end with maybe the most critical of these networks, the G1 to S cell cycle checkpoint. This is the cell's ultimate quality control.
It has to be. This is what stops the cell from replicating damaged DNA. It's a mandatory stop sign. If there's a double-stranded DNA break, a kinase called ATM gets activated.
And that starts a domino effect.
It starts a phosphorylation cascade. ATM activates other kinases, which ultimately leads to the inactivation of a phosphatase called CDC25.
And if that phosphatase is blocked,
Then its target, the cyclin CDLA complex, stays inactive. And that complex is the engine that drives the cell from the G1 growth phase into the S phase, the DNA synthesis phase, so that the transition is blocked.
replication is halted, giving the cell time to repair the damage.
Exactly. And failure at this single decision node is a direct path to mutation and very often to cancer.
So let's try to synthesize all of this for you.
Okay, first, homeostasis. It relies on passive control, keeping substrates near the gammalars of those rate-limiting enzymes. Second, long-term control. That's about changing enzyme quantity, managed by synthesis and that very selective ubiquitin-proteasome pathway for degradation.
And third, the rapid instantaneous control. That's your allosteric effectors, your feedback loops, second messengers, and those irreversible zymogen activations.
And finally, you have these reversible covalent modifications, phosphorylation and acetylation especially. They create these integrated networks that act as molecular decision nodes, letting the cell respond to this huge array of signals all at once.
And we just saw how these chemical tags, acetylation, phosphorylation, act as a layer of epigenetic information, defining what a cell is actually doing. So if nutrient availability through systems like the sirtuins and the texin AD plus eta ratio can shift the entire acetylation profile of your core metabolic enzymes, we'll leave you with this to think about. How profoundly does your diet influence the information code that defines a cell's activity beyond just its simple energy intake? Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.